I had a mother who was this absolute prayer warrior, but then I had a dad who was a drug addict, you know, in and out of the house. I mean, completely emotionally distant, but then from the age of 8 became like an actual distant, absent father. He literally left the home. I just had this inner conflict because I felt like I'd experienced the goodness of God through my mother, and yet the harshness of the reality of life through my father. On the outside I looked fine, and yet on the inside my entire emotional infrastructure was shambles. I was heading in a direction where I just saw no hope for internal peace. I even just couldn't even be around babies, which is kind of wild, you know? And so then friends started to have kids, and I remember they'd be like, do you want to hold the kid? And I'd be like, no, I don't. I hated the thought of becoming a dad myself. Saw no hope for being able to experience a level of just like peace with even looking at healthy versions of fatherhood. I look at my friends and their dads and just feel incredibly envious of them. Just being like, God, why is it that they got to experience this, but I didn't? I became obsessed with this one scent, this one cologne. And I remember I walked by this one man. I was working for a church at the time, and I walked by this one man and he was wearing this scent. And I kind of just complimented it on him. And he was like, oh, thanks, man. So we just kind of start mingling about that. And then the following Sunday, he comes up to me. He goes, I got something for you, by the way. And he brings a full bottle of that exact aftershave. And I remember just being like, that is so expensive. I can't accept this. And he was like, I'm married, you're not, take it. You need it more than I do. And he made like a joke about it. It kind of just broke this barrier between the two of us. And instantly, I just felt like I could trust him. A couple of weeks later, he invited me over to this ping pong thing that he'd been hosting. I go down to this and he's like, let me drive you home. He then just starts talking to me about my life, and he's like, tell me about your mum and dad. And I'd gotten really good at being able to deflect. But for the first time, I experienced someone like resist that. And he went, no, tell me about your dad. And I wasn't ready for that. You know, I'd had every single possible rehearsed answer in my head on how to deflect from it, but I actually wasn't ready to answer the question itself. And yet for some reason, him giving me that bottle of aftershave, him taking me for a drive, he'd created this really safe space. But again, it wasn't rehearsed. And so what then proceeded was like 45 minutes of just verbal vomiting. And at the end of the drive, as I'm about to walk into my home, he goes, you're gonna call your dad this year. And I was like, there's absolutely no way that that's gonna happen. You don't understand. I made a decision when I was 17 years old that I'm never gonna talk to him again. And he goes, you're gonna call him. And I remember it was just stuck in my head. And then I wrote down on my calendar, I was like, right, I'm not gonna call him today, but I will call him in 6 months, just before I hit 20. And that was my goal. I was 19 years old, and I decided I'd call him before my 20th birthday. It's the day before my birthday. I go to call my dad, and he picks up the phone, and I go, hey, and he goes, hey, who's this? And I go, it's Jordan. And he goes, Jordan who? And I go, it's Jordan, your son. And then there's like this 5-second gap, which felt like an hour, because he didn't talk. And then he goes, I've been praying every day that you would call me. Every bitterness I'd felt towards him just silenced, and I just saw a human being who just so desperately wanted to be reunited with his son, irrespective of all the mistakes that he had made. It really felt like the Spirit was just helping me hold space for that conversation. I say that, after 3 minutes I was like, if I don't hang up, I'm gonna cry. I really felt this, again, this calling sensation from the Lord, and just this pride from the Lord as well, where he was going, you've gone on this journey and been able to re-dignify your dad. You've honored him in more ways than you know. And what that ended up doing was creating space for me to be able to even reconcile with him. And so that forgiveness journey didn't look like this, cool man, I know you did all these things that really hurt me, I forgive you. It was this long line of being able to actually see the human in my dad, and perhaps the younger child that never actually got to experience growth and healing and be blessed into manhood. And so I often go, man, it's tough to be a dad when you're still a boy. And so being able to recognize that in his story actually was what helped me to experience a level of reconciliation and forgiveness for him. I always recognize that moment as a sliding doors moment, because I think there's a world where I don't call my dad, where I just decide to hold on to it. I think that Jordan is still holding on to the bitterness of dad and what happened with dad. And I think the Jordan that I become 7 years later, sharing a story of being able to experience God's redemption and God's healing powers. I'm just very grateful that the Lord did end up sending these wonderful father figures who stepped in and just kind of unlock a different element of healing for my journey. And you know, there's this passage of scripture which says he'll be a father to the fatherless. And for the most part in my story, I was like, that just feels like a fridge magnet verse, you know, one that you kind of look at and go, that's cute. But I don't know if I'll actually experience the reality of that. And I think when I look back on my story and I just recognize that he has redeemed so many moments, often those moments of redemption have come through a father figure. And for me, I'm like, that is God fulfilling his promise of being a father to the fatherless by sending father figures to ensure that, you know, Psalm 23, you know, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. I can confidently sit here and be like, I lack nothing. Because I very much did have lack, and yet God sent these beautiful father figures to step in and meet those moments of deficit.